Ready.
We're ready.
All right. I'm Ann Gordon Curran from a professional volunteer at the Bowen Center for these Thursday meetings that happen monthly, usually before the clinical conference meetings. So you're always welcome. It's the only free meeting that I'm aware of at the Bowen Center. So please enjoy while you've got it. I did want to make one comment before we move on, and that is when you do unmute in the course of the evening, I think you're supposed to unmute from the right-hand column of participants, not at the bottom of the screen. Is that correct? I'm not getting a response, so I gather.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Want to be sure that people know that because sometimes you miss your turn. All right, I think the first thing is for Dr. Carrie Collier, who wanted to introduce herself and some of her thoughts. So Dr. Collier.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to say good evening and welcome to everyone. This is I think a great way to end the year 2020, which has been full of trials and tribulations for families and individuals around the world. So I just want to thank Dr. Doug for coming and Dr. Kenton Durston for connecting the Bowen Center to Dr. Doug. So thank you, everyone, and have a good evening.
Thank you, Carrie. All right, this evening we have a speaker, Dr. Doug Neufeld, and let me get. Tonight, we are privileged to have Dr. Doug Graber Neufeld join us. I invited him to speak at this meeting before the spring conference on creating a climate for change, but he was unable to accept that invitation and wanted to try another time, so here he is. Dr. Neufeld lives in Harrisonburg, Virginia, just down the road a piece at the foot of the Appalachian Mountains. He's the director of the Center for Sustainable Climate Solutions, a collaborative effort of Eastern Mennonite University, Goshen College, and Mennonite Central Committee, and he teaches at Eastern Mennonite University in the biology department. He began his career with a degree in biology and then was awarded his PhD in environmental physiology from the University of Texas in Austin. His work on environmental issues, both locally and internationally, has been focused particularly on water. Aside from teaching, he has, through work with the Mennonite Central Committee, served two-year terms, first in Cambodia, working on environmental issues, and more recently in Nairobi, Kenya, as Water and Livelihoods Advisor. It was there that he worked with water, sanitation and hygiene programs and conservation agriculture projects in arid and semi-arid in eastern lands in eastern Kenya. Dr. Neufeld has presented his work on many stages, written extensively, and engaged in many local international projects. Everything from Eastern Mennonite High School Science Fair judge to presentations and projects in Phnom Penh and Kenya, among other places. He is very actively involved in environmental issues locally and in the state of Virginia. Dr. Neufeld is married and has two sons with whom he enjoys many opportunities to go hiking and camping in the beautiful Appalachian Mountains. Tonight, he will present for us his thoughts and research on climate change anxiety, breathing in a world in crisis. Dr. Neufeld.
Thank you very much, Ann. And I am delighted to be here this evening. Thank you for everybody for showing up. I teach at a university here, and at the end of the semester here, things get really quiet before the holidays. So I'm appreciative of you folks turning up at the start of what I know is a break for most of us. So I'm going to dive in. I'm going to try to share my screen here. Can folks see that? Anne, can you? Okay, I see some nods, yes. So as Anne said, what I want to talk about tonight is in fact climate change and some of the emotions which surround climate change and how we work with that in the type of work we do, especially at the Center for Sustainable Climate Solutions and other folks that work in the field of climate communications. I'm going to start out by showing you some graphs. I'm a scientist, so I apologize ahead of time. I like to show data. But these graphs here will perhaps look familiar if you look at them closely. They are all accelerating, unfortunately, and they represent three of the, of course, the major challenges that we have right now in society. On the left is COVID cases in the United States as of about a week ago. And so as everybody is painfully aware, those have been accelerating. In the middle is actually a quantification of the words racist or racism in a number of major newspapers. And you can see that those have increased as well, which of course does not indicate that racism wasn't there before, but of course also we are much more aware of that than, have become more aware of that than we were in the past. And then on the right-hand side is a graph showing the carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere over a larger period of time. And again, increasing in more recent times. Now, it hasn't escaped many people's attention, I would say, so it's not, I'm not the first person to note this, but there is at least a metaphorical connection between these, and that was in the title and in part of my description here, and that is, of course, with breathing. COVID is a respiratory disease, and so one of its major impacts, of course, has to do with our ability to breathe. The events surrounding racism, which have especially accelerated with the death of George Floyd, who famously said the words, "I can't breathe," which has been taken up as symbolic of the suffocation that many within the Black and Brown community feel. And then, of course, when we think about the atmosphere, when we think about the climate, then we are talking about the very air that we breathe, and to think that that is something, in fact, that could be changing. This acceleration is not limited to those things. Those of us that work within the environmental field, we can note many things which have accelerated. In this particular graph is illustrating what's sometimes called the Great Acceleration. A number of different things, everything from population to fertilizer consumption, all the way to McDonald's restaurants, that especially since the 1950s, we see that there is a rapid change in many things, and many of those things which are related to environmental issues. And so the world seems to be heading someplace when we look at exponential graphs like this, but the question is exactly where is it going? And we have the sense, of course, that that cannot be increasing forever, that there has to be something that's happening there. And so hence we end up with the concern that we would label in many cases anxiety and other types of emotions which surround the changes like this that we're seeing. So when we think about this acceleration, people, of course, worry about these things. And so I wanted to show a little bit more data here, illustrating results from the Chapman University Survey of American Fears. If you've ever followed this is a fairly well-known survey which is done every year. On the right-hand side, you can see the top 10 fears of 2018, which is the most recent data, at least that I could find for this. And what's interesting about that is that if you look at the color coding, the top 10 fears from left to right, 5 of those 10 are that bluish color, and the bluish color is in fact different fears which are associated with the environment, everything having to do with water issues, which I work on, over to global warming and climate change, which is number 9 on the graph there. Well, the other thing that's interesting is if you compare that with other years, you look at 2016, 2017, which I show in the table on the left-hand side, that's actually something which has come up more recently. 2016, these environmental issues were high actually, but they were not in at least the top 8 that are shown there. 2017, we had a change, and most people would interpret this as a change within, this is in the United States, so a change within the US government administration, and the changes in people's thinking that that at least were partly responsible for that change in concern. So people have these worries, and of course the elephant in the room, or the 500-pound gorilla, is climate change. So these other challenges that we have are certainly important, but it is climate change that I want to focus on tonight. And even though things like COVID and some of these other things are in the news more, we still, of course, hear a lot about climate change, and many would argue that climate change is at least as much of a challenge as some of these other things that we think about. And you know, those that work in the climate field would say that obviously one of the problems we have is that we're not making as much progress on this as we really need to. And so the question then becomes, why is that? And that's the question that I kind of want to center much of the discussion around as we go through these issues tonight. Now, I have to, at this point, just give a little background about where I came from, and graciously talked about some of the things that I've been involved with, but I do want to give some caveats and explanations. I am a natural scientist and a teacher, and so I have taught at Eastern Mennonite University for the last 20 years. I teach in environmental sustainability issues from a science perspective. A lot of what I do, the picture on the left here, is just a course in natural history that I teach, which illustrates well my concern with a sense of place that people have, their ability to connect with their local environment. So that's a part of what I do. The second kind of way that then I would connect with this issue is the work that I've done overseas. Again, as Anne was explaining, I've worked in a number of places overseas. Pictures on the right are some from my more recent work in Kenya, both in the slums of Nairobi, but also in the arid lands to the east of Nairobi. In both cases where there are challenges to water, but actually in both cases where these are folks that are already seeing the effects of climate change. And so although I'm going to be the first to admit that I am not a psychologist, I am not a sociologist, I'm not a counselor or therapist, which I think most of you would come from that background. But what I do bring to this question is a perspective of, in part, of the people who are suffering from this most immediately at the moment. And the work that we do also at the Center for Sustainable Climate Solutions, and how we apply the types of lessons that we have learned about how you communicate information and how you change people's minds, frankly, and how you change people's behaviors. So that's this other part of my job with the Center for Sustainable Climate Solutions is also then something which centers the work now that I do. So the Center for Sustainable Climate Solutions, I just want to say a few words about this. I won't say too much. We do have a number of different programs which are going on. And again, as Anne said, this is a collaborative program of Eastern Mennonite University, Goshen College, and Mennonite Central Committee. Mennonite Central Committee is a relief and development organization, much like, say, World Vision or one of the other larger organizations would be. We are concerned with moving the needle in climate issues, particularly within faith communities, and particularly within the Anabaptist community. If you're not familiar with the Anabaptist community, Anabaptists include most prominently the Mennonite Church, Mennonite communities, but also others, Church of the Brethren, Brethren in Christ, even constituents like some of the Amish communities. If we vary a lot, you may, with Mennonites, you may think of buggies and head coverings and such, but like most denominations, most communities, we have a whole range all the way from very progressive to very conservative. And so in fact, some of the data that I'll show here are, I think, illustrative of what happens in general society in terms of the different ideologies, right, that people come from, and yet still trying to be in the same community. The type of work that we do, I'm not going to go through all this table here, but I think a few key points are instructive just for you to understand the perspective that I come from. The way that we envision what we do at the center is to work with a particular community. Again, we work with Anabaptists. We have a particular model or particular approach that we take with that. In our case, two centering ways we do that are one is called Trusted Voices model, and the other is working with values, trying to connect with people's values. We do that through a number of different programs. We work with students, we work with congregations, we work with trying to lift up the voices of people around the world who are most affected by this issue. And then we also work with innovation and scholarship as a critical point, as a key part of how we try to change, starting with this faith community, how we try to change what people are doing in particular. We have an external component to that as well. So we are trying to take the perspective of a particular community and the solutions and actions that they come up with, and contribute that to the broader climate communication community. Okay, so enough about that center. What I want to do tonight is kind of step through a couple of different things. These are the kind of the sections of the talk that I want to talk about. I want to start out a little bit with just thinking a little bit about where we are in climate change. I'm a scientist, but I promise I'm not going to go into the details of all the physical chemistry and everything having to do with climate change, but there are some things that we need to think about if we're going to go on and think about how people respond, especially on the emotional level, especially if we're thinking about issues of anxiety. So then we'll go on and think a little bit about how, from my perspective and what I hear within the climate change community, what we know about how humans are responding, and then a little bit about how, again, we might be able to do that a little bit better. So at this point, I want to actually start out in a way that an author called Michael McCarthy does. And I want to invite you, if you're willing, to go to the chat and answer this particular question right here, which is whether when you were growing up, whether you had a special outdoor place that you can remember. And I'll just give an example for myself here. When I was growing up, mostly I grew up actually in Kansas, but I spent a couple of years in North Carolina. We moved to an area around Chapel Hill, and for somebody who came from the plains of Kansas, this was actually an amazing experience because it was sort of the first time that I was able to explore forest. And so as a 7th and 8th grader, I spent a lot of time just wandering through these woods. And at a time when I had changed location and was trying to make new friends and understand a local culture, which was very different, obviously, from Kansas. It was a place of solace for me. And in fact, this crumpled up paper I have here is a map that I drew as a 7th grader, where I had taken those woods and I had named the Great Woods and all these canyons and different trees that were in this particular area. As you think about these areas, and you can continue to I invite you to continue to type things into the chat there. It's always interesting to see the types of places that people have. And as I'm looking at this, it's interesting to me that people, people I think from this audience will be in very different places. So some of you will connect with more of woodlands. Some of you connect with more of water. As you're thinking about this, then another thing I'd like you to think about is, if you think of that place, is that place still there? If you were to go back there right now, would you find that place? Well, actually I can tell you, because I went back to this place in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and I found the apartments where we lived in some 30, 40 years later, and those woods were gone, as you may predict. There was a big box store, there was a parking lot there, and so this place from my childhood had disappeared. So the reason I say this is that there is this book, The Moth Snowstorm by Michael McCarthy, I would highly recommend, actually. I think he did an amazing job of writing something which is a powerful memoir of him growing up in what he would describe as well, I should say it's a memoir that connects with ecological impoverishment. So he grew up in an area where he was able to take nourishment from the beauty of nature, particularly within the context of a family where his mother was suffering from mental illness and eventually died from that. And so he talks about how he's able to connect with the natural world. And it's a very elegantly articulated story. It's in the tradition of much of environmental thinking, where we think about how we take solace and strength from the natural world, but it's also talking about how this is disappearing before our eyes. The title of this book, The Moss Snowstorm, I think is actually very interesting. When he described that, I thought, this clicked in my mind, and I thought this is true. If you think back to when you were growing up, when I was growing up in Kansas, sometimes we would go visit my grandparents, and it would be a warm summer night, and we'd get to my grandparents an hour away, and the front of the car was covered with squash moss, and the windshield was covered with bugs. And he says that that's his experience when he was growing up, but he says that doesn't happen to him anymore. And in fact, when I thought about it, I thought, you know what, my kids, I don't think that happens to us anymore. And I'm sure it does in some places, but the reason that he points that out is it's illustrative of the changes that are occurring in our natural world. And his point, in very brief, is he thinks that the solution for us is we need to recognize our ability to love the natural world in a way which is a very affect-oriented. And so he's very critical, for instance, about sustainable development approaches or ecosystem services approaches being the only way, which he views as much more sort of quantitative and cost-benefit analysis type approach. So I say that because I think he does a pretty elegant job of bringing us into that emotional world of connecting with the natural world. This, what he calls the great thinning, for those, again, of us who work in environmental science, is something that we hear often, and you will see it in the news as well. There was the last 1 or 2 years, a lot of news about what some have called the insect apocalypse, which was maybe illustrated by that change in moth populations. This is where folks in various parts of the world have looked at insect populations and found that there are fairly dramatic decreases. And of course, people are very concerned about this. These changes are not just the disappearance of things, it's also an increase in the human built, the things which are associated with humans around the world. So this, for instance, is a graph which is showing the weight, the mass of mammals on the Earth. The light gray and the dark gray are us, the dark gray right in the middle, and our livestock and pets. The red or the orange that you see is the mass of wild mammals, wild animals. And so what you can see in something like this is that we have largely taken over the mass of the Earth in terms of wild mammals. And in fact, that extends to other things. I just saw a week or two ago that they now estimate that the human-built environment, that is the concrete and the asphalt, now is greater than the biomass of the Earth if you were to add up all of the plants and the fungus and animals and everything. And so, of course, we are having a large effect. Of course, this talk, we're focusing on climate, which is something that we hear much more about, although these other things are going on as well. So I have to show at least one picture here. And what I did on in this case was to overlay my lifespan in terms of my anticipated lifespan in terms of the years. And if you look at where that falls in terms of where the temperature is predicted to be, like by the end of my lifespan, we hope to keep it at 1.5, but it's more likely it'll be more like a 2 degrees Celsius increase from pre-industrial times. We're at about 1 degree Celsius above those times at the moment. My kids, of course, and if I have grandchildren, then my grandchildren are going to be in a world which potentially has 4 or 5 degrees Celsius on average on the Earth higher. And it's worth noting, of course, that we're trying not to let that happen. That would be the blue area there. But at the moment, we're on course to stay in that blue area. And then just two other quick graphs here are on the left. And so we come up with these different ways of trying to quantify this and show this. Two of the ways that often come up, one is called planetary boundaries. If we look at different types of things like ocean acidification or ozone depletion, we try to say, okay, on the planet, are we using so much of that? Are we having so much impact that the planet cannot adjust or cannot provide? And we want to stay within, in this case, within that safe planetary boundary, which is the green. We've exceeded that for climate, even more so for biodiversity loss, and in fact, nitrogen cycling, which you probably don't hear quite as much about. Other people have tried to connect through something like what we call the Earth Overshoot Day or Country Overshoot Day. This is kind of like thinking about the Earth as being a bank account. Every year you have a certain amount of money. In this case, we have a certain amount of resources. And at a certain point, we use up the interest which is provided from what you have in that bank account. And if you continue to use money, if you continue withdrawing, then effectively what you're doing is drawing down the capital that you have. And so in different countries, we hit that point. For us, it's actually in March this coming year. So within 2 or 3 months of starting, we will have used up what the Earth provides for us. So part of the reason I put this up is that, you know, as people that work with these environmental issues, we're always trying to think of, okay, how do we communicate these things? And obviously part of what we're headed towards here is what are our emotional responses to this? So what I invite you to do at this point is to, if you are able on your web browser, and I think you could do this on your phone as well, go to, you see where it says respond to, so this is an online poll. If you go to polleveryWhere/DGN1, it should come up with this question here. And if you can type in actually as many of these as you feel like typing in. Type in what emotions you feel around, specifically around climate change, although of course it primes you with some of this other data that I've been putting up there. So as those come in, they should show up on the screen here if I have the technology set up correctly at this point. So I'll just give a couple of minutes and hopefully a few of these will come in. I'm interested. It'll start to make it kind of a word cloud up here and put together the most common words. Okay, good. A few of them are coming in. So just making sure that this is happening. Sadness, helpless, so fear. Daughter, yeah, so there's some interesting ones coming in. Overwhelmed, sorrow, guilt, bury. So some of those that are coming up at the top here, of course, are some of the ones that we want to focus on tonight as we go through some of these emotions. Anger is coming up pretty strong. That's interesting. Again, fear is pretty strong as well. And helplessness, see a lot of that. Okay, very good. All right, I'm going to move on to the next slide. It will continue to put those in. I think it will capture this. And so for those of you that want the PowerPoint afterwards, then you can be able to see the results from that survey. Thank you very much for those of you that contributed to that. It gives us a sense of what people are feeling tonight, especially. Okay, a few other things before I go into this, kind of some general things to set the context. So one of them, sorry, I just hit my space bar. I wanted to make sure that I was not muted. So one of those is that I just want to emphasize that when we think about the climate crisis, particularly among the scientists, we do think of it as being a scientific consensus. So I'll get back to this a little bit later, but you often hear the phrase that 97% of scientists agree on this, they have a consensus that there is climate change happening and that it is human caused, and of course that it's an issue as well. And so we come up with various reports. These are some of them within the last couple of years, which have come out. So I'm not going to, in this talk, I'm not going to go into all of the evidence for why we think that is. I'm just going to skip over that. Perhaps there's some discussion at the end, but we want to focus more about some of the other aspects. I will say, and this is maybe just stating what really the rest of the talk is about, but we have learned a lot about the psychology of climate change through people that have worked with this. This person right here is Dr. Catherine Hayhoe. If you hear anything about climate change, you probably hear about her. She has a PBS series, which is called Global Weirding, and highly recommended. It's very accessible. She's a wonderful communicator. Those of us within faith traditions also engage with her a lot because she does come from a faith tradition. I think she's Baptist. Her husband, I think, is a Baptist pastor. So she understands very well some of the communities who have been, in fact, most skeptical of this. The other thing which really we have to mention, because it frames everything, is that this issue is largely political. Okay, so that's a rather stark statement. It's not the entirety of it, but if you look for what correlates most with this, it tends to be ideology and political factors. So this graph here is some data that we actually took from some of the Anabaptist community. I tried to summarize it a little bit, so let me just say a few words about this. On the left here, this graph is showing environmental apathy. So if something is going up, it means that in that category, somebody is becoming more apathetic towards the environment. Okay, so for instance, in this lower thing here, we're saying that if you look at a population of people, the older they are, the more female they are, the higher income or education they are, in our population, that didn't change how much, in fact, they cared about the environment. At least there wasn't a significant relationship. A little bit more if you look at where people live. The more rural people they are, which might be a bit ironic, but that's what we came up with. The more in the Anabaptist context, we talk a lot about simple living. People that valued that less were more apathetic about the environment. Sorry, I have some double negatives in here, I think. But then if you look at the steepest slope, we're seeing that in general, and again, we're talking about populations here, so you can't apply this to any one individual, but as a population, the more conservative or Republican the population is, the more apathetic they are, according to the measures that we have. And there's some nuances to that, and I think we'll get to a little bit of that a little bit later. Okay, so I want to go on a little bit to think about how, in fact, we think about humans responding to this. I'm framing it in terms of knowledge, attitudes, and practice or behavior. I don't know within your field if this is a common way of thinking about things. It is, I will say, within applied sciences, within international development, which is where I take a lot of this. The work that I do in providing clean water to communities or providing water for irrigation for farmers, for instance, this is the way we think about behavior change. We want to know, is the knowledge there? What are their attitudes towards it? And do they actually do something? Do they have a particular practice or behavior? So to say a few words about these, what we know about these. One is that if we think about knowledge, just a couple of points about that. One is that, so I'm just flipping through my notes here. One is that really it's not a lack of knowledge, which is the problem. We'll just put it starkly at that. It's not telling people more about climate change. That I don't think that within the scientific community that there's anybody that really thinks that's the case. It is important, knowledge is important, the accuracy of the knowledge and how that's presented. A few things that we've found particularly helpful. One is that the issue of misinformation is really important within climate change. And of course, it's very important and salient within general society right now. There have been some good studies, some of them coming out of this group right here at Maybach, George Mason, Anthony Lasarowitz, who I think is at Yale, have worked some with what they call inoculation, which is a really interesting idea. This is where they can take groups of people and they prime them and they say, okay, you know, here's some misinformation about climate change, which you are likely to hear. And it turns out that if you prime people with that, essentially you're inoculating them against the misinformation, that actually is really effective at preventing people from buying into that misinformation. And furthermore, that's just as effective in different populations. It's just as effective with people that are more on the climate denier side, for instance, of the spectrum, as opposed to those who are very active. So it's this type of how do we think about presenting knowledge that I am, in fact, most interested in. I'm interested in the particular knowledge we put out there, but how do we work with that? The other thing to say about this is that when you look at a study like that, or you think about how we present that, we think about this within the context of consensus. So I said earlier that we have this clear notion that 97% of scientists agree with the evidence around climate change, and there's good evidence that if we can communicate that and if people understand that actually changes their attitudes and then hopefully their behaviors later on. So it's a leverage point that we can work with. What's a bit surprising to some of us is the number of people who don't understand that don't understand that most scientists are in agreement on this particular case. This graph here is going back to, this is some of the survey work that we've done within Mennonite colleges. There's 7 different colleges that we've worked with. We have a sample size of 600 or 700, I forget the exact number. When you look at different categories of students, we categorize them from the left to the right, are kind of those that are most concerned about climate change to those that are sort of more towards the denier side. And if you look at those bars, the darker green means that those are the people who really understand that most scientists agree about the climate issue. So if that makes sense to you, what's striking about this and what this graph shows is that most of these students, which are supposedly hearing about some of this in the college, most of them really don't understand that most scientists agree about this issue. So this is something that, again, is a leverage point that we hope that we can work with. Attitudes, when you think about attitudes, so again, taking some data from the students that we've worked with, in this case, this graph here with the orange bars, we've disaggregated it according to their self-reported ideologies. So from the left to the right are students who say, I'm very conservative, or going to the right saying, I'm very liberal. And then we ask them, how important is global warming to you? And so on those bars where you see any sort of red or orange color or pink color, that means that they at least they feel that it's at least somewhat important to them. Okay. So then if you look at that graph, again, the striking thing about it is that at least down to students who are somewhat conservative, most of them think that this is important, that global warming is important. In fact, very few students identify themselves as very conservative, at least the ones that replied to this survey. That's where you get a little bit more people who say, well, it's not that important or it's not important at all. But in fact, very few people, and this is one of the points I want to make, very few people are like this quote right here. This was a quote from somebody who has responded to a worldwide survey that we've been doing within Anabaptist communities. So the person the kind of quintessential person who's a real climate denier and say this is all rubbish, there are actually very few of those people out there. At least they're a very small percentage of the population. They're very vocal, but they are not most of the people that we work with. And frankly, they're not the people that we are targeting to engage with. There's a much larger portion of the population that is kind of in the middle. These attitudes about climate change, we know that this reflects what happens in general society. So this graph here shows, if you ask people, do you think global warming is happening? It has been fairly steady, kind of creeping up. And what's interesting about this is, well, one of them is that most people would say, yes, global warming is happening. Again, few people, down around 10% now, say that it's not happening. But the other interesting thing is that even after COVID came up, that there is still a lot of concern. So, this question of, well, did COVID just divert attention from climate change? Well, in a sense, we do hear a little bit less about climate change, but it appears from the survey work that actually people are just as worried about climate change as they were before this other existential crisis came up. And I want to point out here another thing, which is that if we look back to some of the kind of these key points that I was talking about earlier, one of those I would say also is that youth respond differently. And so this is one of those subtleties that if we look, for instance, at ideological differences, that again, Republicans and conservatives tend to engage less with global warming, climate change issues. But if you look at younger generations, there is less of a difference between conservative and liberals on this particular issue. And so that, I think, is important to keep in mind. And then if you think about practice or behavior, how much are people actually doing? What are they doing? Again, there's a lot of evidence behind this. I would just say that our general understanding is that we are not doing enough and that people are not changing their behavior enough. Just one way to think about this particular data is looking at how many students engage their local public officials on global climate change. And again, the green bars would be those students who, at these 7 different colleges, who have actually gone to a public official or met them in a meeting or something and talked to them about global warming. Very few students have, and maybe that's not surprising, they're quite young, but it, I think, does illustrate that oftentimes, although people have the knowledge and the attitudes, that this doesn't translate into action. Okay, and so this is kind of the central puzzle of a lot of how we think about this, is why does this knowledge and attitudes not translate into particular practice? One of the books which I think actually illustrates this really well, not just with respect to climate change, but there's a book called Strangers in Their Own Land, where the author, Arlie Hochschild, looks at Cancer Alley in Louisiana. Louisiana falls at the bottom of, unfortunately, at many things like health measures, but if you look at pollution and toxins, because there's so much industry, a petroleum industry especially, they fall towards the bottom, and people suffer the most in Louisiana compared to most other states. They have the lowest, the least, I should say, stringent regulations as well. And most interestingly, people in Louisiana oftentimes are least supportive of more regulations, and are most supportive of candidates, for instance, in the political system who are more about not regulating the industries. And so the author frames this in terms of the great paradox. Why is it in the case of voting, for instance, that in many cases people will seemingly vote against their own interest? And that, again, this is something which seems to be happening here. We are not, in short, operating within what you might call, this rational actor model, which I'm sure that all of you have heard about before. So if we look at our emotional response then and kind of ask, okay, how do people respond emotionally, much as you all have entered in that survey earlier? What do people think about that? So I want to start with students a little bit. Again, this is some data that we took from students in these Mennonite colleges. We asked them, which of these statements do you identify with? You can see it goes from global warming isn't happening, which most students did not say. Most of them identified with the yellow and the blue bar here, which are either that global warming is happening, but people aren't going to change their behavior, or global warming is happening, but we're really not sure. There seems to be a lot of pessimism, skepticism, which is associated for these students, for this younger generation, in what they see, right, for the future, so that it would perhaps point towards some of these problematic emotions which are associated with how students think about this. There's been some more comprehensive work on this by a number of other groups. One of them is to give credit to folks at the University of Hawaii. Krista Heiser leads a lot of this, and she's done a lot of surveying of students there. These are the main, how she would categorize the main emotions. So you can see here we have hope, fear, sadness, shame, and anger. And then the words that were elicited when she was doing this work are listed under those categories. So the interesting thing here, right, is that it's not just what you might, I don't know if you want to call these negative emotions, but it's not just emotions which people might find discomforting, but it's also the emotion of hope actually came up quite a bit as well. So it is more complicated. It's more nuanced in how students are thinking about this. Students, of course, are one segment of the population. How do other segments of the population respond to this? I find it interesting that professionals, in this case scientists, actually respond similarly. I'm pointing out here, this is a website called Is This How You Feel? This kind of went viral, at least among the scientific community and among other places as well. This was an offering for scientists to handwrite their emotions, how they're feeling about climate change. And there's a lot of scientists have responded to this. Some very interesting reading that's on here. What I want to point out is that if you go through that, you see a lot of these same emotions. You see hope, you see despair, but what you see added onto that is awe. So what you see in these professionals that work with climate change oftentimes is this kind of, again, this kind of morbid fascination or this understanding of the incredible nature of the natural world, and this sort of being blown over by the fact that this awesome physical process can actually be impacted by us as humans. So that concept of awe is actually mixed in with those emotions. This notion that that as we learn about something that we have kind of a different response to it is not new. Aldo Leopold, who is kind of one of the quintessential early environmentalists and an author who is sort of one of the fathers of modern environmentalism, wrote this quote here, which is oftentimes quoted: one of the penalties of an ecological education is that one lives alone in a world of wounds. So pointing to, I think, something very important, which is that as you learn more about something and you appreciate something more, that you make yourself more vulnerable as well. And so that if there is damage to that, then in his words, then you suffer the wounds of that. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm actually skipping over a few things here. I want to point out a few specific responses that we get. Again, this is a worldwide survey that we've run. You can read some of those. I've highlighted some of the emotions which are associated with that. Some of the interesting things here, I think, are one, if you look at the difference between how people respond in what you might call the global south or developing countries, as opposed to, say, Canada or the United States or Europe. Oftentimes we do see a difference. For instance, if you look at in the middle here, the response of this person from the Democratic Republic of Congo, a place which would be impacted already by climate change, they say, you know, we feel frustration during the rainy season. So folks in this area, they depend directly on when the rains come, and they are feeling very directly what's happening right now, and they fear experiencing the worst. And this has been illustrated in other studies as a consistent observation. So we do see a different response from folks that are in the global south. Another interesting one, you look down here at this response from the US, that they feel complicit. So this is one of the complicating emotions as well, that this is not something that somebody else is doing. This is something we're doing to ourselves. I mean, we can identify certain actors, like certain, you know, some people will identify certain corporations, but we all consume and we all produce greenhouse gases. So it becomes very difficult for people to think about this when they're implicating themselves in that. There is an intergenerational component too. You can see the response of the person from the Netherlands. And you'll notice the last response as well, that oftentimes people that are practitioners in areas which are impacted by climate change are more and more actually saying that they themselves are feeling the anxiety and feeling the emotional impacts of this. So as people have thought about these emotional responses, we've come up with kind of this whole list of very specific ways to talk about these emotions as they're applied to these climate and environmental issues. So these are some of them that you may have heard of before: climate anxiety or eco-anxiety. I'll get back to environmental melancholia in just a bit. One of them that I want to point out at this particular point is something we call solastalgia. This has gotten a bit more press lately, so again, it's something that you may have heard of already. Solastalgia was articulated most succinctly by an environmental philosopher in Australia, Albright. I forget his first name just offhand here. But what he says in this, he's created this word, which is kind of a combination of solace, again, going back to the notion of the comfort that we get from the natural world, but then the second half of that, which points towards either nostalgia or what I gather, the algae, I think part of it I gather is associated with sickness or illness. And so what he observed in the context of Australia were areas where people had their home, the place that they were being connected with was being destroyed or was being altered. And he observed certain symptoms in the people that were experiencing that. So the people were experiencing pain when the place that they really knew and loved was under attack. I think what's interesting about this and what has been pointed out is that the things that people are experiencing when they are in their home, when they are in their place, but their home has been transformed into something that they don't recognize anymore, that this is something which is not new, that the indigenous peoples, for instance, have been experiencing this for quite some time. I pointed out two farmers here. These individuals here were very formative to my experiences in Kenya. There were a couple of farmers that I worked with there. Maiwa and Kanina lived in a semi-arid regions right next to Tsavo National Park, which is well known for its wildlife, but is a very arid region, is a difficult place to survive. But you can survive there if you know how to work with the environment. They knew how to do that because, in particular, they knew when the rains came. If you're farming in this area, you have to know when the rains come. You can't irrigate. You have to plant the seeds right before the rain comes. So it's critical you know that. But that has changed. And so for them, they get crops like this. You can't even see the beans on their plants. And they should be harvesting what they will survive on. But they unfortunately are not doing that. They are suffering from, and you could see it in their faces when you talk to them, that their home, the way that they survived had changed. So I think this is part of what Albright and others are talking about when they talk about this notion of solstitation. So then the question for us is also then what happens to these emotions? And I actually want to skip through again a couple of graphs. Again, you can tell that I'm a scientist. I like a lot of these maps and these data. But I think that these are actually really informative to me. Data which has, again, come out of some of these climate communication centers where they've gone through and they've asked questions all across the country and looked at different counties and looked for their responses. When you look at these maps, if it's a warmer color, reds or yellows or oranges, they agree with this statement more. If you see blues, the cool colors, then they don't agree with this. Okay, so when you ask people, do you think global warming is happening? And you look at this map, it's all in the warm colors. So most people agree with this. Again, it's pointing to what I had indicated earlier. If you ask, is this going to harm future generations? Again, most people understand this. What's also interesting is if you look at this map and you look at where it's particularly warm, where people are most concerned, and you can see it in this map as well. If you ask them, are you worried about it? Right, so getting to some of these attitudes. What really comes up is places like in South Texas, places in certain areas in New Mexico, places in southern South Dakota. If you know much about geography, you should start to kind of cue into the fact that these are Native American communities, these are some immigrant communities, again, pointing towards probably communities which are being affected more by climate change. And we know this, that different populations actually have different degrees of concern about climate change from other surveys. This was a survey before the election looking at Hispanic, Black, and white voters and trying to look at how concerned they are about global warming as an issue that they're thinking about in the election. And in this case, Latino voters were much more concerned about global warming. Actually, Black voters were as well, but they were concerned about a lot of different things as opposed to people that self-identify as white. So I think it's important to remember that there are different populations which have different levels of concern. The other interesting thing is that if you ask yourself, well, okay, so they're worried about it, but do they actually want things to change in terms of, for instance, policy? If you look at how many people support, for instance, funding for renewable energy, it is off the map. It's deep red. Basically, almost everybody agrees with it, independent of your ideology. So even if you're in a segment of the population that is more skeptical about climate change, you tend to actually agree with that. And even regulation, which is not a good word among some segments of the population. But most people would agree that CO2 should be regulated as a pollutant. Now, so these colors are all orange and red. This one is blue. Most people don't agree with it. What don't they agree with, or what they say they don't do, is they don't discuss global warming, at least occasionally. This is not a lot. We're not asking them, do you talk about it a lot? We're asking you, do you at least occasionally talk about it? Very few people do. Okay. So this is, again, the crux of the issue that we think about, is that people care about it, people know about it, people want to change behaviors even, but we don't talk about it, and we don't end up changing our behavior. So this is what a number of scholars have really centered their work on, and I want to point out a couple of people here. One of them is an anthropologist or sociologist. Her name is Kari Norgaard. She wrote this book called Living in Denial, has been a seminal book in this area. She lived in a village in Norway, and she studied the villagers there. They studied the residents of that village and what they thought about climate change, how they experienced it. Norway, this village in Norway, they are seeing very dramatic changes in the amount of snow, and much of their lifestyle revolves around snow. And much of their culture does it, and that's changing for them in very concrete ways. Norway is known as a country as very progressive and sort of environmentally friendly. They are also a country which depends heavily on petroleum. They're one of the top petroleum producing countries in the world. So there is some cognitive dissonance there. And in short, what she found was that they did not talk about this issue, even though those changes were so central to their lifestyle. And so what Norgaard says is that what seems to be happening here is illustrated by this quote from a villager here, who says, you know, what we want to do is protect ourselves just a little bit, right? So saying that this is a very problematic thing to admit that we are complicit with what's happening here. And so as a response, in order to, I don't know, keep themselves healthy or something, however you want to think about it, the response of that is to not talk about it. She then outlines what she calls a number of different types of denial. And she says, what's happening here, and I don't know, these may be common terms in other fields, I don't know, but within the climate community, she is the one that's known for articulating these. This is not literal denial. They are not denying that climate change is happening. It's not interpretive denial, which is saying, okay, it's happening, but we have faith in the progress of humans, and so we're not so worried about it. This is what we call implicatory denial, which is to say that we understand the seriousness of this, but we are not able to integrate it into how we live. And oftentimes people talk about this in the context of communities and label this as what they call socially constructed silence. So there is kind of an unwritten agreement that this is such a problematic issue that, that we're not going to talk about it. And as a consequence, it doesn't get talked about. The other person who is really key to this is a psychologist, somebody who comes from a psychology background, Dr. Renee Lertzman. And so again, you may have heard some about her. She's gotten the most attention for this. She wrote this book called Environmental Melancholia. And so she takes up a lot of these similar themes and really articulates in kind of an applied way that what we're seeing here is what she calls the myth of apathy. And so the fact, you know, again, that people are not talking about this, and the fact that people are not acting on this particular issue is not because they're apathetic about the issue, but for her, it's because people have reached this state of basically a paralysis, because these are such painful issues in order to deal with. People are not able to engage those in a way that can lead to a particular change. And she further identifies what's sometimes called anticipatory mourning, or pre-traumatic stress syndrome. It was back on that last slide, actually, forget the particular term, but thinking about traumatic events which you anticipate as coming in the future and how you deal with those in the present time. So again, somebody who has been seminal with this field. Okay, so how do we respond to these better. And I'm going to, I'm coming up on about an hour here. I'm going to ask, I'm sorry, either Anne or Ellen or somebody there, if it's okay if I go 5 or 10 minutes here, or if I need to start skipping over slides more, I can certainly do that as well. Absent any objection, I'm just going to continue through with some of these. I do want to leave time for questions and conversations, so I promise I won't go too long here. Okay, so how do we respond to some of these things better? We know, again, to emphasize, this is not an information deficit model. It's not an issue of people knowing things more. One of my favorite studies, which I think is one of the most formative ones that illustrates this, was looking at, if you look at different populations, in this case, they've labeled them as egalitarian, communitarian, or hierarchical individualist. Again, I don't know if these are common terms within your field. They're basically saying ideological conservatives would be the purple, ideological liberals would be the green. And what you would predict, if you educated people more, if they knew more about the issue, you would predict that they would be more concerned about the risk. Okay, and in particular, people that are most skeptical of it, that you would, in this model, you would say, okay, you know, if we teach them more about it, they should become more concerned. When they tested this, this is what they find. I find this absolutely fascinating, that if people are more educated about climate change, if you already think that it's a problem, you become a little bit more concerned about it. If you don't think it's a problem, you become less concerned about it. Okay, and this is an observation we see in other contexts as well, right? That we use information very selectively, and in fact, as you become more educated, we know that you become more sophisticated in how you can select information, which in many cases just reinforces what the position that you've already come to. So in the context of what I'm talking about here is really just emphasizing that we can't just add information onto the layers that we already have. Some of the things which I think are helpful, one of those is thinking more about issues of ritual and navigating, or sometimes has been called by Jennifer Atkinson and Judy Twett at the University of Washington, navigating the emotional terrain of eco-anxiety and grief, thinking about using creative arts, for instance, in order to kind of name and tame that grief which is out there, identifying that grief, and by doing that, being able to, among other things, know that you're not alone in this, and that by knowing that you have a community, being able to engage with this. I'm not going to play this, but I invite you to look up on YouTube. You can look up this piece on Arctic sea ice. If you look for Judy Twett, she has set to music things like the changes in Arctic sea ice. So as the person plays this piece, you can hear the tones changing into a lower and lower key. And so it really is something which, in sort of a very visceral way, is able to connect with people. Joanna Macy, again, is another person who has worked a lot with rituals and how those can be helpful. Again, I'm going to skip through some of this a little bit. Oh, I have to mention that Charles Darwin is another person who we could put into that category. Charles Darwin said, you know, one who remains passive when overwhelmed with grief loses the best chance of recovering elasticity of mind. So the notion that within that grief, that by engaging that grief and by engaging those anxieties, that in fact there are some positive things that can come out of that. The last thing that I want to say, because this is where kind of the rubber hits the road for many of us who work in the climate change community, is how we think about issues of anxiety with respect to hope. Within, I'm sure in other fields as well, but within the climate change community, there are virtual food fights between how we approach going to public audiences and saying, okay, how do you think about this issue? Do we, to put it succinctly, do we present it in a way which elicits fear? David Wallace Wells is the best known person in this field. He wrote an article and then a book called The Uninhabitable Earth, where he started out with this cheery sentence here: "It is, I promise, worse than you think." And his article is, it's worth a read, but it is a litany of all of the bad things that could happen. And his approach is that by doing that, you elicit behavior change. He's saying that you elicit concern, and that leads to behavior change. On the other side, and what's actually more common, within the environmental community is to present a more positive, to appeal to hope. So the Environmental Defense Fund, for instance, which I have great respect for, but they do take this approach. So when you look at their materials, they, instead of appealing to fear, they will appeal, for instance, to the positive things that are happening. Here's a list of a few of them that they listed a year or so ago, which they're hoping will help to not scare people off, to not put people in a state of paralysis as they think about these issues. So this thinking about anxiety and hope back and forth is one thing we think about a lot. Again, I apologize, I'm going to skip through some of these and just go to, I'm going to go to this slide right here. There have been some really good studies on this within the climate change community. One of them that I found most helpful, again, this group, Ed Maibach and Anthony Lasarowitz, have thought about this in a more nuanced way, thinking about different types of hope and different types of doubt. So for instance, thinking about constructive hope versus false hope. False hope would be more of thinking about, you know, God's going to take care of it, or nature is going to solve the problem, we don't have to worry about it, as opposed to constructive hope, where we see others acting, and it's through, for instance, seeing other people acting, that we have a more realistic hope that's out there. And likewise with doubts, it's not a fatalistic doubt that we think that that there's no way that we can handle this problem, but it's a doubt where we have concerns about it. And this actually would point back to some of those responses by some of our students who would say that they're not sure that we're going to take care of this problem. This, I think, would be an example of what Maibach and others would call this constructive doubt. Okay, the last thing that I'm going to just leave off of, I want to circle back just to think about different populations. I think a lot of this has a very Western perspective. And there are a number of people who have pointed out that this question, especially of, you know, these negative messages versus positive messages, can play out in very different ways in the global North as opposed to the global South. And we oftentimes see this. So in the global North, for instance, the Sierra Club, you can see the statement here. They will often present, again, a very positive message because they want to make sure that people are engaging in sort of an optimistic way. Whereas those in the global South, and you can see here in the center of the slide, a number of statements by activists that are in the global South, have what some people would simply call a more realistic view of things, saying that, look, you need to be aware of what's happening because this is what we experience on a daily basis. We can't just experience this as hope, because for us, this is in fact the reality of what's happening. And it's not just within the global South, but it's also folks which are in the indigenous communities, folks which are in, for instance, marginalized urban communities, those that are suffering from the worst of environmental racism or environmental pollution in many of these communities. So it connects to many of these other communities, which kind of circles back to the start of my talk when we were talking about changes in racism and, of course, changes in COVID as well. Okay, apologies for rushing through a little bit of that, but I have gone over, and so I just want to end right here. I want to give thanks to some folks at CSCS, colleagues, both here at Eastern Mennonite and other organizations we work with, and these other folks at some of the associations, some of the groups that we have learned from over the years and who think a lot about these issues. Okay, so thank you very much for sticking with me on that. And I will end that here. I think maybe, am I turning it over to Anne or Ellen?
Yes, you can. Thank you so much, Dr. Neufeld, for that presentation. We will open up now for a discussion, and we will be using the raised hand feature on Zoom. So if you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand. That is available on the participant button and then the blue hand feature. So we'll wait and see. Harold Lockett, if you'd like to.
Yes, yeah. Thank you, Dr. Neufeld, for your presentation on climate change, which was very informative. I guess when I was, just a little preamble here, when I was thinking what I know about climate change, I always think about plastic in the sea and how we need to get the water, plastic out of the ocean. And, you know, and the commercials I see about that, that brings me about climate change.
Yeah.
But my question to you is, why do places like Africa and Antarctica are more affected by climate change than maybe we are in America and other Western world places?
Yeah, so part of that has to do, if you think about tropical areas, for instance, part of that has to do with areas in Africa or Asia or Latin America, which typically operate on a narrower temperature range. You know, so the dramatic seasonal temperatures that we experience here in the United States, for which we've centered our lives around. Our crops, for instance, are centered on the fact that we have summer and we have winter. The areas that I worked with in Kenya, for instance, they have a narrow range of temperatures that they experience. So if you look at like a 2 degrees Celsius change in the United States, where there's already a lot of variation, compared to 2 degrees Celsius change in Africa, where there's not much variation, that 2 degrees Celsius is bumping their experienced temperatures further out of kind of their normal range of temperatures where they're normally experiencing that. In some of the other areas, like the Arctic, there are some, one of the things we talk about a lot are feedback cycles. So one of the things that's happening in the Arctic, for instance, is part of the reason that the Arctic is kept cool is that there is so much ice there that reflects the heat and the light out of it. And when that ice disappears, then more heat is absorbed in those environments. And then the more heat's absorbed, the more ice is melting. And it's actually a positive feedback loop, which exacerbates itself. So that particular feedback loop that happens with ice is not something that we see happening, at least so much, in more of the temperate regions. Yeah.
Kristen Lehman.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Neufeld. I have a question, and really it's directed more at the collective group here. I know that we have a wealth of knowledge of people who are experienced in applying Bowen systems theory to different areas. And just curious, as someone who is on a track to coach groups around how to take action around this item, overcoming that fear and anxiety, and directing more towards maybe hope. Just wondering here if there's any ideas that people here who are more versed in systems theory than I, things come to mind to anyone here around how to get at that, how to get those actionable steps you could help a group take in taking action towards these things. And I'm welcome to any and all feedback, including Dr. Neufeld.
Yeah, thanks, Kristen. And I would welcome feedback from the audience. I wouldn't be able to answer that because I'm not in that field, but I'm really interested in what other people would identify.
If anyone would like to respond to Kristen.
Yeah, it's Dave Galloway. I had my hand up to respond to that. Where I try to think about is the idea of getting very clear on how I want to show up for myself. What are my convictions around how I want to be with respect to the planet, my interconnectedness and interdependence on the planet, my desire to be as non-impinging as possible on the system. And I've got to get for me, I've got to get very clear about that for myself, and then just tolerate the discomfort and just try to live to my principles every day, whether I think it's going to make a difference or not, kind of thing. It's like get very clear on my conviction on how I want to show up in this issue, and then just do what I can to live to it.
Mm.
Didn't say it was easy.
Yeah, yeah.
Or that I'm doing a good job.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. And just thank you so much for this presentation.
yeah, you're welcome.
Ms. Harrison, would you like to comment?
I sort of feel obligated to comment, but I'm certainly ill-equipped. The first action I took, based on appreciating my own personal impact on climate change, was in 1977, when an environmental ecologist I was dating convinced me that the hairspray I like to use for big Texas hair was destroying the ozone.
Mm, mm,
And I gave up aerosol hairspray.
mm.
It was a huge sacrifice for a Texas gal. But the continued effort to understand the impact of climate change
Mm, mm.
on a territory, on a family, is very challenging. What I find in my own Texas family, who would represent the very pale color yellow
Right,
in Central Texas,
right.
who really deny climate change, don't perceive it. It isn't visible to Central Texas the way it is visible to you in Africa, or to Houston with the floods
Right.
that Dr. Hayhoe describes so beautifully, and Jim Blackburn here at Rice. What I find is it really has to be personal.
Mm,
I think people respond with less denial and the great discomfort of awareness
mm,
when it is personal, and when the problem is more painful than denying,
mm, mm.
when it isn't successful to deny the problem,
Right.
and to deny one's complicity in it.
Right.
You know, related to oil men, to branches of my family that are profiting by climate, by their impact on the climate. It's very difficult to accept responsibility for participating in a problem of this magnitude.
Right.
And I find it's just chipping away at interacting with people in a more personal way that can have any impact, if it does at all.
Yeah.
Do you know Dar Jamal?
I do not. No.
He is a Houston man
Okay.
who, with his family wealth, set out to go see the parts of the world which are experienced the greatest impact of climate change.
Mm, mm.
And then he's written a book about it called The End of Ice.
Yeah.
He's now living with indigenous in Alaska to really experience the decline in the ice there, and how the villages and the holy men are adapting to the changes and writing about it.
Right.
I think he's a good example
Yeah.
of being able to have enough of a personal experience to then act on it. He's bought land where he thinks in 50 years there'll still be water, but no floods, and can homestead for future generations of his family. I think we all face those kind of decisions.
Yeah.
If we can look ahead to the implications of the changes at hand. But I think they're evolutionary, and we're all reacting long before we know it.
Mhm, mhm.
I've got to stop. There are a lot of other blue hands. Thank you so much for what you added. I think what Bowen theory adds is the operating principle of seeing one's part in a problem and then taking responsibility for it.
Mhm.
And it also adds the importance of looking at family history. Every one of us is a survivor of families who have experienced versions of climate adversity,
Mhm.
often that forced migration.
Right, right.
And I think if people know their history, that's not on the list of people that you've reported or described. It's not a method, but I think it's a method Bowen theory adds. So let me shut up because you got a lot of other smart people in line.
There's some great, yeah, there's some great, thank you very much for that. I agree with that. Those are great. I want to give other people a chance to comment as well.
Tammy Martins.
Hi, thank you so much for this presentation. I'm in Madison, Wisconsin, a pastor of a liberal progressive church, one of 3 pastors, been there for 13 years. We have a very active care of creation team. And, I think they just struggle with, I'm guessing that a lot of people are very mindful of climate change in our liberal progressive theology church, highly educated people, There's sometimes tension because there might be a belief among the care of creation team that if we could just get the youth to speak about this, then adults will change their behavior.
Mhm,
And
mhm.
I just wondered if you've heard of that before. And I think
Yeah.
I have 2 teenage kids who are really wanting grown-ups to stop putting the burden on the youth.
Yes.
And not that they're doing that specifically. I mean, they're very kind, wonderful, they're just trying hard to figure out how do you get some traction more in it with the church community, right? And a lot of them are politically involved in trying to make climate change, being climate change advocates. But I didn't know if you've known of that kind of tension. And there's a sense among some of them that, like, if the youth could just speak, then older people will change their behavior. And there's some tension there because some of the youth get really mad about that.
Yeah, that's interesting. And that's one of the things I skipped over there was Catherine Hayhoe, who I mentioned earlier, has done some surveying of that. And when she asked people in her many venues, what do you associate with hope? The most common answer is youth. So that does come up very often. I became very aware of this. I teach at a university. I work with undergraduate students. And we kind of had that inflection point where there was a lot of, okay, we knew that the board was not going to listen to us faculty. The board listens to the students. And there did come a point where the students said, look, this isn't fair. Like, you guys messed this up and you expect us to fix the problem? And they had a point. And so I think at that point I became much more aware of really how there's some truth in this. Yeah, people do listen to the youth and they are the hope for the future, but we need to be very careful about how we do this. And perhaps most importantly, and this is what I think Renee Lursman would really emphasize, is that our job is to enable them and to create safe spaces for them in order to do what they can do to support them. I think when those things happen, then it's less of, okay, we just dump this on you and now it's up to you to fix it. And it's more of, we're in this together, and we can come to this with our individual strengths.
Thank you. I really appreciated you looking at the emotional piece of it and that more knowledge does, because we are all about seeking more knowledge, and it just often gets us nowhere. So anyway, thank you so much.
Yeah, and that's one of the positive things. I go to scientific meetings, national scientific meetings. 20 years ago it would have been different, but now these are all scientists and they're all talking about the emotions of it. They're all talking about, how do we communicate this better, not better information, but how do we become sort of more likable and more believable? That's really important and is actually an immensely positive movement.
Lillian Rosenbaum, just for the final word.
Oh, okay. Hello. Hi, Victoria. It's good to see you. I am Lillian Rosenbaum. I was the first faculty for the advanced students in Dr. Bowen's program. I'm 86, if you don't do math fast. I don't. But that's back 1969. And I'm sitting here thinking about my dad. My father was born in Vienna. So you do some math here. 1897. I was born in Guatemala, came to Boston to go to Tufts, et cetera, et cetera. Lived in Washington, D.C. area for 60 years and obviously central with Dr. Bowen's program. My dad raised us kids. I'm the oldest of three, so I've got to say that, of course. And you did a beautiful presentation, and I'm just thinking in parentheses, Dr. Bowen would have appreciated the facts. You did magnificently with the facts. So my dad raised us to, we have only one planet and we have to conserve it. And it was like, that's how life was. When my son, who's my number 2 kid, and he's now 60, was about 15, he comes to me one day and he says, Mom, how come he wasn't angry. He was just asking, how come you ask us kids to separate? You ask us, he didn't say kids, to separate the paper from the trash. Because the word recycle didn't exist then, he says to me. He was a Boy Scout at the time. What made you do that so long ago when people didn't even know that word or think about it? And I quoted a sentence, of my dad, we have one planet. I think one of the things that I was trying to think of is your presentation in terms of transmission of a process. I think it's not too late. Any of us can transmit anything in our own family. Of course, work is even better, like you're doing. I have 4 kids. I just at the age of 1, they're all 50, 60 something. I have 11 grandkids. One of my grandkids, she's actually, it's more than one, but one of them has specifically decided to study what? Environmental studies. She's at GW. Just, she was a kid and she was already trying to quote do. So I think that the way you presented it is beautiful. I like the part about there is more awareness, I think, in people than, or maybe I tend to be optimistic, back to my dad and family, and surviving the Holocaust and this and that and the other, because it's interesting to me to see what you had here, that most, or a large percentage, I don't remember, I wasn't writing it down, 75, 80% of adults that do invest in renewable energy. That's amazing. Because people didn't grow up thinking about that. I didn't hear one word of that in college, let alone grad school or anywhere else until, recent years is, So I think that the fact that people feel, to use the word, Dr. Bowen's difference between feeling and fact, the way that fact people feel bad about it is one thing, but the fact that they're doing something, even if it's for their own good and they're investing in companies that do that, I think that's really interesting and really worth an idea that can be transmitted in people who, in our families, or in people who are teaching, those who are teaching their students or trainees or whatever. I've said more than I was going to. I was going to say nothing, but Lillian Rosenbaum being what it is. So thank you very much.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you.
Good to see you.
I'll just say one comment on that. Thank you very much for that. You had a comment about values being passed down through families. I think this is, and I didn't touch on this at all, but I think this is something we think about a lot. And one of the other food fights that happens within this is what, how do you appeal to people, not fear versus hope, but Are you
Mhm.
appealing to people from a practical standpoint, saying this is
Mhm.
good for you, like it's not economically, this is going to be good for you? Or do you appeal to people's moral intuitions, for instance, or their values? And I think that I've been somewhat concerned that there's not been enough attention put to how people think of what's right and wrong in this particular state. And I think part of that are the values that we get passed down in our families. So yeah, I'm happy to hear you say that. And I was kind of reading some of those things into some of the other comments as well.
Great, thank you. That will conclude our discussion time, and I'll pass it back over to Ann Curran.
Thank you very much, Dr. Neufeld. I found that fascinating. One of the things that occurred to me in that, though, is I'm interested in your captive audience of college students who are still developing physiologically and in their brains. And these kinds of subjects are interesting to them, I would suggest, but they may not be able to take them on yet. And therefore, I still think that more senior, the parental generation has, they've got a different perspective on life. They're not still developing, expanding in the same way that the youth are really still growing. Until what, mid-20s or a little past that in some cases. So that's the thought that comes to mind about who you really listen to. And they do want guidance. They need guidance still. They're still learning. We all are in many ways. Thank you again. And let me tell you about next month on January the 21st, 2021. Can you believe it? Dr. Daniel Papero will be giving us a presentation on the value of connection to survival, differentiation, cutoff, and the family system in troubled times. So please join us at 7:30. And we look forward to having you, and you all have a wonderful holiday and a very blessed new year.
Thank you, Ann.